I wanted to attach the swing to the main build, along with the connecting drive system. I'd left space in my framework with no struts to get in the way, though I did want to build more support around the swing once I'd got the placement right. The drive system comprised two awkwardly connected toggle joints. Even though I'd geared the system down twice, it was still way too quick when tested. The best way to really slow things down is with worm gears, but it was going to be a difficult job connecting the swing to this. The gap was just larger than two 16-tooth gears. I wondered whether I could use a chain to make up the distance, but the worm gear's width interfered with it. Technically it did run, but I wouldn't want the chain and gear wearing against each other, so I'd need to find another way of... excuse me. I'd have to find a Okay, fine. So looking at this blurry image here, I couldn't really move the 16-tooth gear over because of that chain, but even if I could move it over, the worm gear would then collide with the turntable. The chain would also restrict how I could connect framework to the axle to hold the swing in place. Ideally, I wanted the swing to rotate through 180 degrees. A quick test with a 16-tooth gear rotated around 190. But finding a gear combination to shave off those extra 10 is something which I honestly still haven't solved. It took me a long time putting together a frame to hold the swing in place with the various restrictions, and get it ready for its first proper test run. Nuts. So the first test run of the swing was a flop. The whole structure was too loose and gears were separating and slipping, so we need more reinforcement. For visual and practical reasons, I was using a black 8-long axle with stop as the pivot, but this was creating some issues for me. I was trying to constrain the depth of the build, so adding on extensions wasn't really practical here. Instead, I'd have to bring additional gears out to meet the swing's driving gear. To make things just that little bit trickier, using 16-tooth gears meant that connection points on the swing weren't directly aligned with connection points on the main framework. After spending some time building what I thought was a good, solid frame, and nicely colouring it in, I remembered that I had to keep the area around that 24-tooth gear clear, so that it could swing. Back to the drawing board then. In order to keep the framework out of the way, it would have to come from above, and be only one stud wide for the axle to pass through. It had to clear the group of gears and be joined to an external frame that it was vertically misaligned with. Easy. After a couple more unsuccessful attempts, I wondered if I might have more luck running the swing below the worm gear. But I couldn't really afford to lower the swing any further, nor raise the columns any higher. So I'd have to somehow raise only the axle with the worm gear. I could do that by adding a gear to the first axle and chaining it to a second axle above. It still took some time and effort creating a frame to support it, but it was much easier to keep it out of the way of the swing arm. I felt my columns were maybe a little limited in their movement, so I decided to swap out the smaller linear actuators with larger ones. My current gear ratio was 1 to 2.79, so I'd need to reduce, or maybe it's increase, the ratio. I played around with a gear calculator and came up with a ratio of 1 to 4.17, which should move the columns a little under twice as far. The solution used a 16-tooth gear, which doesn't play well with other gears, so I had to put together a slightly awkward frame to pair the gears together and insert it into the drivetrain of the build. An initial test with no load moved the actuator as expected, but upon adding the column in, a problem arose. The column was too heavy. Increasing the speed of the output had reduced the torque beyond what was needed, and this was with only one column in place. So how else could I increase the distance travelled between direction changes? Another way to do this would be through increasing the time between the changes, giving more time to travel further. This could be done by driving larger gears with the worm gears at the input. With the new gears in place, the column was able to move again, albeit at a much slower pace. But this greater range of movement now meant that the column was rising above the guides, keeping it upright, so they needed to be extended. This wasn't too much of a problem to do, but the extended range also meant that they were rising above the bottom of the spike pits, and that meant extending the length of the columns. But more length means more weight, and that brings me back to square one. There has to be a way around this. My columns had a weight problem that needed resolving. I'd had an idea that I could reduce their weight by hollowing them out, but I was a little concerned about potentially compromising their structural integrity. My concerns were unnecessary, as the physical model held together well, and I'd managed to shed nearly 40 grams of weight. So I'd increased the range of movement, increased the length of the columns, greatly reduced their weight, and all was working well. And it was at this point I decided the columns didn't actually need to move as far as they were now moving. Oh well. So I may have had the columns moving right, but the swing not so much. I wanted it to swing through 180 degrees, as it does in the game, but I needed to find the right gear ratio. Now, somebody more intelligent could probably calculate this using maths, but I didn't pay enough attention in school, so I'm going for a trial and error approach. I set up a test area and got to work testing different combinations of gears. The first test with a 28-tooth gear actually came quite close, swinging around 200 degrees. So a slightly larger gear should rotate slower and swing a little less distance. Next up was the 36-tooth gear, which is technically a lot larger, and did swing a lot less distance. But there unfortunately isn't a gear in between these sizes. I estimated I'd need a ratio of around 30 to 1, so I tested out some ratios in a gear calculator and came up with a close but slightly awkward solution with a ratio of 30.96 to 1. But testing this actually seemed to rotate around 200 degrees again. My next test bumped the ratio up to 33.4 to 1, and an even more awkward combination involving a turntable. Let's see how this gets on. That's maybe 165 degrees? So the solution lies somewhere between 31 to 1 and 33 to 1. That can only leave 32 to 1 then, right?